The cameras had been rolling for 23 minutes when everything changed. Canon O'Brien was in his element, leaning back in his leather chair, that familiar warm smile playing across his face as he bantered with one of Hollywood's most legendary actors. The Late Night with Canon O'Brien studio was bathed in its signature golden glow. The audience of 300 people hanging on every word as Harrison Ford shared stories from 5 decades of filmmaking. It was supposed to be a celebration. Ford was there to promote his latest project, but more than that, to reflect on a career that had given the world Han Solo and Indiana Jones. The conversation had been flowing beautifully, anecdotes about George Lucas, behind-the-scenes stories from the Star Wars set, gentle ribbing about his famous reluctance to do interviews. The audience was eating it up, and Canon was masterfully guiding the conversation with his trademark blend of humor and genuine curiosity. Ford, at 82, still carried himself with that unmistakable presence that had made him one of the last true movie stars. His hair was silver now, his face mapped with the lines of 8 decades of living, but his eyes still held that spark of mischief that had made Han Solo legendary. He wore a simple navy blazer over a white shirt, no tie, the uniform of a man who had never needed to try too hard to command a room. The studio lights caught the silver in his hair as he leaned back in the guest chair, completely at ease despite his well-documented discomfort with publicity. This was different, though. There was something about Canon's approach that seemed to disarm even the most guarded celebrities. Maybe it was the genuine curiosity, or the way he listened, not just for the next question, but for the person behind the persona. "So, Harrison," Canon said, shifting forward slightly in his chair, his red hair catching the studio lights, "I have to ask, and I know the fans are dying to know, are you still flying? I mean, you're famous for being this incredible pilot, and I've heard you've got quite the collection of aircraft." It was an innocent question, the kind of light-hearted inquiry that usually led to fun stories about aviation adventures or close calls that would make great television. Canon expected Ford to launch into one of his dry, self-deprecating tales about landing on taxiways instead of runways, or maybe share some wisdom about the freedom of flight that had sustained him through decades of Hollywood pressures. Instead, something shifted in Ford's expression. The easy smile that had been playing at the corners of his mouth faded completely. His shoulders seemed to settle lower, as if the weight of the question was physically pressing down on him. He looked down at his hands for a moment, those weathered hands that had gripped countless airplane controls, wielded lightsabers, and cracked bullwhips across movie screens worldwide. The silence stretched just long enough to be noticeable. Canon's instincts, honed by years of reading guests, picked up on the change immediately. Something about this question had hit differently than expected. "Actually," Ford said finally, his voice quieter now, stripped of the casual banter that had characterized the conversation so far, "I'm grounding myself next month." The audience, sensing something different in his tone, fell silent. The usual background murmur of a live taping evaporated. Canon's smile faltered slightly, his interviewer instincts picking up on the sudden gravity in Ford's voice. This wasn't the direction anyone had expected the conversation to take. "Grounding yourself?" Canon asked gently, leaning forward slightly. "By choice. Or—" Ford looked up, meeting Canon's eyes directly. In that gaze, Canon saw something he hadn't expected: vulnerability. Raw, unguarded vulnerability from a man who had built a career on playing characters who never showed fear, who always found a way through impossible situations. "Age," Ford said simply, the word hanging in the air like a confession. "It's catching up with me. My reflexes aren't what they were. My vision isn't what it was. And I won't risk other people's lives because I'm too stubborn to admit that I'm getting old." The studio fell completely silent. Not the comfortable silence of an audience waiting for a punchline, but the profound quiet that settles over a room when someone speaks a truth so honest it demands reverence. 300 people held their collective breath, sensing they were witnessing something far more significant than typical late-night television banter. Ford continued, his voice steady but heavy with emotion that seemed to surprise even him. Flying has been my freedom for over 50 years. When the world got too loud, when Hollywood got too crazy, when I needed to remember who I was underneath all the characters I played, I'd get in a plane and just fly. Up there, it was just me and the sky. No scripts, no directors, no expectations, just Harrison Ford, not Han Solo or Indiana Jones, but me. Canon found himself setting down his note cards without even realizing it. The carefully prepared questions suddenly seemed irrelevant. This wasn't going according to any interview script, but he could sense they were in the middle of something far more important than planned television. The producer in his earpiece had gone silent, apparently recognizing that this moment needed to unfold naturally. "And now?" Canon prompted softly, his voice carrying none of its usual theatrical energy. Ford's voice cracked slightly, revealing decades of carefully controlled emotion finally breaking through. "Now it's become my fear. Last month I was flying my Husky over Yellowstone, and for about 30 seconds I couldn't remember where I was. 30 seconds doesn't sound like much, but when you're flying, 30 seconds of confusion can kill you. And it wasn't just about me. There were other aircraft in the area, people on the ground. I realized that this thing that had been my greatest joy was becoming something that could hurt innocent people." He paused, running his hand through his silver hair, a gesture that seemed to strip away the movie star veneer and reveal the vulnerable human underneath. "So I made the call. Next month, I'm officially surrendering my pilot's license. After 53 years of flying, I'm done." The audience was completely still. Several people in the front rows had tears in their eyes. Camera operators, who had filmed thousands of hours of television, found themselves moved by the raw honesty of the moment. This wasn't entertainment anymore. This was a man grappling with one of life's most difficult transitions, letting go of something that had defined him for more than half a century. Canon felt something shift inside him. He'd interviewed thousands of people over his career, from A-list celebrities to world leaders, but there was something about Ford's honesty, his willingness to admit vulnerability on live television, that transcended the usual celebrity chat. This was bigger than television. This was about what it means to be human, to age, to face limitations with grace. Without consulting his producers, without checking the clock, without following any of the protocols that governed late-night television, Canon stood up from his desk. The simple act sent ripples of surprise through the studio. In 15 years of hosting, he had never left his desk during an interview. The audience watched, confused and intrigued, as Canon walked around his desk and sat down in the guest chair directly next to Ford. It was unprecedented. Hosts didn't abandon their desks. They didn't join their guests on the other side of the interview setup. The physical barrier of the desk was part of the format, the invisible line between entertainer and guest. But Canon wasn't thinking about television conventions anymore. "Harrison," Canon said, his voice soft enough that the microphones barely picked it up. "Ninfo, can I tell you something?" Ford looked at him, surprised by the sudden intimacy of the moment, by this unexpected breach of television protocol. "I've been watching your movies since I was 10 years old," Canon continued, his voice carrying the weight of genuine admiration rather than professional flattery. "Star Wars, Raiders of the Lost Ark, Blade Runner. You taught an entire generation of us what it meant to be brave. Not fearless, but brave. There's a difference." Ford was listening intently now, his usual guardedness completely gone, replaced by the attention of someone hearing something they desperately needed to hear. "Brave means feeling the fear and doing what's right anyway," Canon said, his words measured and deliberate. "And what you just told us, giving up something you love because it's the right thing to do, that's the most Harrison Ford thing I've ever heard. It's not Han Solo who would make that choice. It's not Indiana Jones. It's you, the real you. And that's braver than any character you've ever played." Ford's eyes filled with tears. Not the calculated emotion of an actor hitting his mark, but the genuine tears of a man who had been carrying this burden alone and suddenly felt understood. The cameras captured every moment, but somehow it didn't feel intrusive. It felt necessary, Important. You know what you taught us to do through all those movies? Canon continued, his voice gaining strength as he found his rhythm. You taught us to fly. Every time we watched you pilot the Millennium Falcon, every time we saw Indy swing from that rope, every time we watched you take risks and make impossible choices, you were teaching us that flying isn't about the machine you're in. It's about the courage to move forward when you can't see where you're going. The cameras were still rolling, but nobody in the studio was thinking about television anymore. They were witnessing something sacred. One human being helping another find meaning in loss, find purpose in letting go. That's a legacy that never lands, Harrison. That never gets grounded. Every kid who dreams of adventure, every adult who needs to remember what courage looks like, every person who has to make a hard choice, they'll think of you. Not because you were perfect, but because you were real. Because when it mattered most, you chose wisdom over ego. Ford wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, a gesture so natural and unguarded that it seemed to strip away 70 years of Hollywood polish, revealing the carpenter's son from Chicago who had somehow become one of the world's biggest movie stars. I've been dreading next month, Ford admitted, his voice stronger now, as if Canon's words had given him permission to feel the full weight of his emotions. Dreading the day I have to hand over my license, walk away from the hangar for the last time. I've been thinking of it as an ending. What if it's not an ending? Canon asked, leaning forward with the intensity of someone who genuinely believed what he was saying. What if it's just a different kind of flight? Ford looked at him questioning, hope flickering in his eyes for the first time since the conversation had taken this unexpected turn. You've got grandchildren, right? Canon asked, though he already knew the answer. Ford nodded, a small smile finally returning to his face. 5 of them. Then you're not grounding yourself, Canon said, reaching over and squeezing Ford's shoulder. You're just changing aircraft. Instead of flying planes, you're going to teach those kids how to soar. You're going to tell them stories about adventure and courage. You're going to show them what it means to make hard choices with grace. Ford was quiet for a long moment, processing Canon's words. When he finally spoke, his voice was stronger, filled with something that hadn't been there before, hope. You know, my youngest granddaughter, Emma, she's 7. Last weekend, she told me she wants to be a pilot like Grandpa. I was so focused on what I was losing that I forgot what I could still give. There you go, Canon said, his own voice thick with emotion now. That little girl doesn't need you to fly a plane to be her hero. She just needs you to be her grandfather. And something tells me you're going to be incredible at that. The studio erupted in applause, but it wasn't the manufactured enthusiasm of a television audience responding to an applause sign. It was the organic response of people who had just witnessed something genuine and profound. Ford stood up, and without any prompting, he and Canon embraced. Not a quick, camera-friendly hug, but a real embrace between 2 men who had just shared something meaningful. Thank you, Ford whispered, just loud enough for Canon's microphone to pick up. I needed to hear that. Thank you, Canon whispered back, for reminding us what real courage looks like. As they separated, Canon looked directly into the main camera, his usual playful demeanor replaced by something deeper, more profound. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, his voice carrying the weight of the moment, Harrison Ford, a man who taught us to fly and tonight taught us something even more important, how to land with grace. The applause continued for nearly 2 minutes. Ford, clearly moved by the response, raised his hand in acknowledgement, but his eyes kept returning to Canon, as if he was still processing the gift he'd just been given. The reframe of his loss as a transition rather than an ending. After the camera stopped rolling, Ford lingered on the set longer than any guest ever had. He and Canon talked for another hour about aging gracefully, about legacy beyond fame, about the challenge of remaining relevant while accepting physical limitations. Other guests had come and gone, but Ford seemed reluctant to leave this space where he'd found such unexpected understanding and validation. By the time Ford finally left the studio, he wasn't walking like a man heading to a funeral. He was walking like a man heading to a new adventure. carrying himself with renewed purpose and dignity. The security guard at the exit later told staff that Ford stopped and looked back at the studio doors, smiled broadly, and said something about good flights and safe landings for everyone. 3 weeks later, Canon received a carefully wrapped package with no return address. Inside was a perfectly detailed scale model of Ford's beloved Husky aircraft, signed in his distinctive handwriting, to Canon. Thanks for helping me find a new flight path. The best pilots know when to change course. Safe travels, friend. HF. Attached was a photograph of Ford with his granddaughter Emma, both wearing matching aviator sunglasses, both grinning at the camera with identical mischievous expressions that spoke of shared adventures to come. The episode aired exactly as it happened, with no editing to soften the emotional impact or remove Canon's unprecedented decision to leave his desk. The network executives, initially nervous about the departure from format, quickly realized they had captured something special. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The show received over 50,000 emails in the first week alone, from viewers sharing their own stories of difficult transitions, of letting go of things that had defined them, of finding new purpose in unexpected places. Ford never spoke publicly about that interview again, maintaining his characteristic privacy about personal matters. But 6 months later, he quietly published a children's book called Grounded: A Pilot's New Adventure, dedicated to his 5 grandchildren. The book, beautifully illustrated and telling the story of an experienced pilot who discovers that teaching young dreamers is more rewarding than flying solo, became an instant bestseller. All proceeds went to organizations supporting aviation education for underprivileged children. Canon kept the model plane prominently displayed on his desk for the rest of his career, positioned where he could see it during every interview. Whenever guests seemed overwhelmed by the spotlight or struggling with major life transitions, he would glance at it and remember that sometimes the most important thing a television host can do is stop being a host and start being human. The airplane became a touchstone, a reminder that authentic connection transcends entertainment value every time. The interview fundamentally changed Canon's approach to hosting and transformed his show's reputation. He began looking for those moments when the script could be abandoned, when entertainment could transform into something deeper and more meaningful. His staff noticed the difference immediately. He listened differently, asked questions that went beyond promotion and publicity, created space for genuine human moments to emerge naturally from conversations. Years later, Harrison Ford never flew an airplane again after surrendering his license that following month. But in rare interviews, he often said that the most important flight of his life happened in a television studio, when a talk show host helped him navigate from loss to legacy, from ending to beginning, from fear to hope. He would tell interviewers that Canon had given him something invaluable that night: permission to be vulnerable, space to grieve what he was losing, and most importantly, a new way to see what he was gaining. The experience had taught him that letting go wasn't about losing control, but about choosing a different kind of strength. The model airplane remained on Canon's desk throughout his entire career, becoming almost as famous as the host himself. New staff members would invariably ask about it, and Canon would tell them Ford's story, always ending with the same lesson. Sometimes the best television happens when you forget about television altogether and remember that we're all just human beings trying to figure things out. The interview became required viewing at journalism schools and communications programs across the country, studied not for its entertainment value, but as an example of how authentic human connection could transform media from mere spectacle into something profound and healing. Students would analyze the moment when Canon left his desk, the precise instant when entertainment became ministry, when a television studio became a sacred space for transformation and genuine human connection. They studied it as a masterclass in empathy and authentic broadcasting communication excellence and humanity, because sometimes grounding yourself is just another way of learning to soar. And sometimes the most important conversations happen when two people stop performing and start being real with each other, even when the whole world is watching.